hotspots, and those red dots are the hotspot cities. So you've got places like Cape Town, South Africa, Bogota in Colombia, Mexico City, Los Angeles, Perth, Sydney as well, the Eastern Australian hotspot. But the interesting thing in the yellow are the hotspot cities in Mediterranean climates. So there's this, we've long known we share something with California, we share something with Cape Town, and it is this incredible, obviously floristic biodiversity particularly. I thought this was an interesting place to start with the Wildflower Society, just foregrounding the biodiversity here. 7,380 floral species. That number's probably gone up since this slide was put together. 49% of these are endemic, and 2,500 of conservation concern. And this is a great piece. Many of you probably have read Paul Goyer's and Stephen Hopper's article 2017, sampling that species richness through the southwest region and the biosphere. This is endemism, showing Stirling Ranges and Lasieux National Park as key hotspots, a little bit around Perth. But then when you take species richness, really Greater Perth just lighting up the map in terms of the species richness. 1,826 floral species in Greater Perth. So it makes sense that we should be really emphasising, I'll talk about the forests at the end, makes sense that we should also be emphasising Greater Perth in the context of all of these conversations that are happening at the moment around our environment. So there we are, Greater Perth. Again, it's a few years old, this map. It's probably sprawled a little bit more at the edges. A lot of my work is making maps and making maps look beautiful and trying to use maps to communicate stories. And this one communicates what I think might be the longest city in the world, and certainly the lowest population to longest city, if you look at that ratio. The contour map of the city, which again is astonishing when you look at it and just take it in. I think if you work out that the Darling Scarp or Cardamunda, if you work out that's about an 80-year-old person, the coastal plain formed in about 3 months. I think that's the ratio of old to young in terms of those two landscapes. And Stephen Hopper would tell us that where the Ockbill meets the Yodfell, the old and the new landscapes, we've got this skyrocketing biodiversity. A wetland city, and this is put together with a range of surface geology maps and other things to attempt to reconstruct this 1826 view of the wetlands, which cover the whole of the Swan coastal plain. You might notice a few shapes in there that are contemporary because you can't get away from that with the maps, but it's an amazingly hydrologically rich city, despite having a reputation for being incredibly dry. Perth City itself, this was a project I did about 10 years ago in my master's thesis, which was to use GIS to create a map of the historic wetlands, which had overlaid into it a range of place names, Aboriginal and colonial as well, settler place names, across the whole of this chain, from Claysbrook all the way through Gallop, Munga, Herdsman, up to the Careen there, and zooming back out to the whole of the city. It then fascinated me to go through the troves of Department of Water archives and uncover groundwater contours and start to imagine this aquifer system that sits beneath the city. So these are those aquifer mounds, Ngara, Jandakot in the south. But to really think through the cultural significance of these waterways and this deep water. This is some maps of that system. With Sandra Harvin, who's a Baladong and Wajik Noongar elder, we worked on a project together as part of the Fremantle Biennale, which was 2 years ago, called Kepa Kaliakul, and she shared these words as part of that project. And here she is here. It was an amazing evening actually that I collaborated with an artist and with Sandra to have this installation in this space which projected light all the way through the old customs house in Fremantle. But the Noongar story was all about the deep waters of Perth and the connection to those waters. So she said, where is your path? My path is the water path. walk slowly and softly when going along, and here the water will sit forever. And I think there's some amazing messages there for us all. Walk slowly and softly, if only we did that more often. So you turn on these layers beneath the city and you see the memories of old streams running along the clay pans, or you see amazing systems at work beneath the city of Perth. And as part of my doctoral research, which has been going on for about 5 years, and I really need to wrap up hopefully next year, but you know how these things just drag on and other things come along like the forests. This was a framework for Perth, really asking that question of, okay, we've got a planning framework, but we don't really have an environmental planning framework. We've got a planning framework that considers open space and other kinds of biodiversity, like bush forever. But what would it mean to really delve into this and consider it in a bit more detail? So this concept of deep structure is borrowed from a US landscape architect, Anne Spern, who talks about the enduring structure of a place, this deep structure of a place, and then she talks about surface structure. So I talk about deep structure, the aquifers, all these things we would know as the sand, the geological types of the city, the ecological types of the city. With Sandra, I sat down and we talked through six seasons, 6 ecological types, and started to give these Noongar names. So Cardamunda is the Darwin Scarp, the Belia, the river systems, the Morn, the black clays, the clay pans, we would know those as the Pinjarra Plains. The Mungit, that word for Banksia, the Bassendean sands, or these the oldest dune, the 3 dunes, broadly. Kipalung, the wet, sandy, the spearwood, in other words, and then the white, the Jundal, the limestone. So to give these Noongar names, Sandra started speaking about the movement through these seasonal landscapes, through this whole coastal plain, and it started to bring those categories to life as I was working through this project. And interestingly, these ecotypes, or these, whatever we call them, biotopes, ecotypes, they're broader than that. They drive threatened ecological communities. So at the coast, the microbial ecological communities and those coastal heathlands. The Chewits, generally associated with that second system. The Banksia woodland, of course, associated with the Bassendean sands and that ancient dune. The clay pan, following, of course, the clays in the east. The salt marshes following the riverine, the Belia systems, and then these ridgelands. So to start to think through the threatened ecological communities, and there are many other ecological communities in these zones, but to start to think through these texts as a basis for thinking about the deep structure of the city. And thinking about it as really unique. If you go to Melbourne, it takes a long time to find a bit of ancient remnant bushland. If you go to Rotterdam or Amsterdam, you won't find anything. So to think of Perth as, it's pretty amazing. We've got a city which has ancient land right in the city. And this is where working at UWA with other, ecologists, landscape architects, botanists who come in, and it's their first day in Perth. You kind of have to introduce them to this whole different context, which we often take for granted, I think. So you zoom into the city, and you can make out the shape of the Swan River there, and you see all these texts around buffers, not legislated buffers, just mapped buffers. And if we come up for air in a way, we come above the city, we've got these surface structures, and what this map starts to draw out is all of the surface hydrological, ecological parts of the city. So this is the current DPLH open space map. This is what's in the MRS as open space, green space. And I've drawn it like this because it's sort of a bit like islands. These are thought of in that way, and then there are of course corridors within this. But what some of these other mapping layers start to do is, I think, go to these ideas of how we think about landscape connectivity in cities. A patch, a corridor, but also a matrix where they all start to join together. And we can start to think, okay, we've got protected area planning, and then we've gone through connectivity planning, and now we're moving toward this. We've had green infrastructure, living infrastructure, urban tree canopy becoming very important. It's like we add on these new ways of seeing the ecological spaces of the city and also the water spaces of the city. Ecological, hydrological, recreational. This is borrowed from a methodology that was developed in London in a project called the All London Green Grid, and it was also rolled out in Sydney about 10 or so years ago in the Sydney Green Grid. So this is the ecological grid once you take into account urban tree canopy density, once you add up all those bush forever areas, all those public open spaces. And this is the hydrological grid. And what's interesting about the hydrological grid is we've got 15-kilometre drainage streams running through the eastern part of Perth that would register as completely degraded on any ecological survey, but are massive ecological potential. And I think we could all see how these maps reveal not only the existing value in the ecosystems, if we use that word, but also the potential for restoration and care in those spaces. So we zoom out to the whole city, and this is the great thing about working in GIS and working with maps, is we've got these scalable frameworks for the city, but then we turn on the dreaded layers of future urban development, and this is again a few years old. Perth and Peel at 3.5 million did limit the urban footprint to an extent, but there's new planning investigation areas, and we're now in the midst of a housing crisis, which no doubt is going to continue to put pressure on the edges of the city in new ways, without a strategic plan, which we still haven't really got for the environment at least. And we look at those layers over the threatened ecological communities. And again, this is super broad mapping, so it is telling a certain story, which is that there is conflict between, obviously, our environment and our future development. So we come in here, and I just want to show you Yulbrook and the Greater Brixton Street Wetlands, which is a project I've been involved with the Belia Group on, and Hans Lambers and Andrea Gaynor, who many of you will know, especially Hans Lambers, who's written and studied around this area a lot. And Kate Taus, I should also mention Kate's work, phenomenal work in documenting these ecosystems. So when you look at the deep structure and you zoom right into the Brixton Street wetlands, it'll become clear where this is in a second. We've got basically all the geological types. We've got the Belia, meeting the Bassendean Sands, meeting the Pinjarra Plain, the Mundjid, meeting the Mourne, meeting the Cardamunda, very close by, and then we've got limestone shrublands and calcareous origin material up there. And all of these texts, 15 texts I think, threatened ecological communities in this single corridor, and many threatened species, and 856 native plant species, this one corridor. So we run from Kenwick Station, the Canning River down just off the image there, through the Brixton Street Wetlands, of course the Greater Brixton Street Wetlands, Allison Baird Reserve, who many of you may have walked, probably a lot of you have walked through with Hans, all the way up through the Yulbrook, which runs sort of in this eastern zone here. The Yulbrook snakes along through there, quite separate to the Greater Brixton Street Wetlands, but part of that connected floodplain. The surface structures. The Yulbrook corridor contains almost 900 native plant species, at least 50% of species present in Greater Perth in only 1% of the area. So it's a great illustration of immense biodiversity in a corridor. I think it's interesting, these kinds of maps, because I mean they're founded on broad observations of the landscape. This idea of a hydroplane was a word that we gave to this zone of clearly pervious land upstream, groundwater stream and catchment area, to the Greater Brixton Street Wetland Corridor. So all the water that's falling here on this landscape is flowing through to the Yulbrook. That's the catchment direction, and the groundwater flow nets suggest that flow, and it's going through the Greater Brixton Street Wetlands on the way. And Hans and ecologists will tell you how many of the species in these wetlands are groundwater dependent, and how many of the ecosystems are groundwater dependent. We go to this drawing, which is, of course, a horrifying drawing in many respects. It's the MRS, and our primary regional roads in red, and our industrial areas in purple, which through an MRS amendment and many decades of planning intention have brought industrial development right up to the edge of this corridor. And there it all is there, commencing at the edges and encroaching on that area. Future urban expansion, the Wattle Grove, you will see that come up as well in the coming months as an MRS amendment, now that environmental review's been finished. So the Beeliar Group put together a pitch for a future Yulbrook Regional Park, which would contain and bring in the buffer zone and the Yulbrook. It connects the Yulbrook up with the Greater Brixton Street Wetlands for a start, which is its major move. But then it brings in those outlying texts and remnant vegetation, but also incorporates enough of a buffer to allow industrial development to still occur at those edges while substantially increasing what would be the Bush Forever site, what is potentially a future Yulbrook Regional Park. So this is currently being considered by the EPA as part of the Gosnell scheme amendments. So we're one step too late. It's gone through MRS, but it's potentially going to be something that can be brought about in the scheme amendment process. And these are all photos from Hans's book that he edited with a range of authors called Jewel in the Crown of the Biodiversity Hotspot. Some amazing species through there. And I think when I walked through there with Hans a few times, with the EPA and others, it's the ground conditions and these you've got intact crust on the Bankshire woodlands that feel like totally undisturbed core of this landscape, which is beautiful. And then you go to the edges and it gets a bit degraded and in need of restoration. And you go a bit further out and you're in totally novel ecosystems. Everything's overgrown. But the quendas still hop between and the birds still fly across. So that's the other thing, is we don't have a mechanism for valuing these kinds of landscapes, which are at the edges of our remnant vegetation, which are really important for the health of our remnant vegetation. The EPA have not been able to find yet a mechanism for protecting that really important core through showing environmental value in this zone. So it was interesting to think about the buffer, and I'll just race through all this because I've got to get to the forests. But there's a whole concept here about ecosystems, high fidelity ecosystems, the potential for restored ecosystems. Now at the edges of that, these novel ecosystems, and this is around the polygon of that Yulbrook Regional Park. And at the edges of that, this idea of a constructed ecosystem. So it could be tree canopy or retained tree canopy or water sensitive urban design or pocket parks, or around the industrial area, it wouldn't really be pocket parks, but
why not?
You know what I mean. Why not? They might want to go to a pocket park for lunch.
Well, that's so true.
It's so true. So we end up with this whole gradient, and this comes out of some ecological theory that I'll show you in a second. But basically, if we take in that whole gradient, we've got high fidelity through potentially restored ecosystems, through novel ecosystems, which really have a right to be there, through constructed all the way to development. And we've got buffer and we've got potential as well. We've got potential that the restored areas might encroach on those novel areas. We've got potential for parks, we've got potential for barbecue areas, we've got potential for all kinds of things. But if you knock that out and you don't have a buffer, we've got high fidelity ecosystems meeting development. And we know that that will have many impacts. So this is the theory I was talking about, Hallett and others. This historical ecosystems, high fidelity, through hybrid ecosystems, which start to not really resemble those historical ecosystems in key ways. The thinking is that there's some kind of threshold here, and this is Richard Hobbs and all of his thinking around this, where you move into novel ecosystems. And then this zone over here on the right, which is where a lot of my peers in landscape architecture are working with constructed landscapes. But if we can see this less as a whole series of gates and thresholds and more as a gradient, we've got a very different kind of city. And I'll show you an example of this in a second. These are the things that can happen in all the different zones. And many of these things are already happening. And we think of something like the Beeliar Regional Park, and there are so many functions that are incorporated in the Beeliar Regional Park across all of these zones. And I think we can't just make, of course, when we've got these decisions being made by planning ministers and environment ministers on the basis of not just environmental but social and economic factors, we have to bring in all of these other arguments for a regional park, and the Bilia Group did. So I'll just skip through all of this, but it's the gradient approach that starts to be able to emerge. I just wanted to make this point, that the images, that these bounded images, these maps that have very clear boundaries, is it a surprise that we then see our landscapes unfolding with very clear boundaries? And this is Rod Simpson, who was the Greater Sydney Commissioner for the Environment Commissioner for the Greater Sydney Commission for 10 years in the 2000s, and helped to develop their green grid, which I'll just show you. And he said these words a number of years ago, and I wrote them down. He said, "These plans become realities." And he was pointing to all these planning documents, and he was showing these aerial images of Sydney. And he was just pointing out that the plans become realities, so we need to shift the plans. More of those areas of Perth that just get swallowed up by this. And Rod Simpson goes on, he says, "Resistance is fertile. We need an environmental plan with a radical shift in thinking, underpinned by landscape, underpinned by an ethos." So just to pull out Sydney here for a second, as an example, this is the Sydney Green Grid. And it's a project that had a lot of buy-in. It had buy-in from the Planning Minister for a start, which wouldn't we love to have in Perth for some of our projects. The Sydney Green Grid was a whole mapping exercise of recreational spaces, ecological spaces, hydrological spaces, and it's brought it firmly into a whole scheme of investment, and critically into all the LGAs and local governments maps this intention of what areas need to be preserved, and how does the city function? What areas have least access to open space? What areas have most access to open space? How can we overlay things like equity on top of this map? So we're now in that zone of environmental planning where it's sort of moving to the edges of conservation and into more of planning questions, really. But it involves conservation quite strongly. So this the western zone, of Sydney, the Aerotropolis, as it's being called, around a possible new airport, is a really good example of planning enshrining open space in the framework. So it's a massive new city, whatever way you look at it. It's a huge economic factor for the city, Aerotropolis. But when you look at that map and you look at this plan for the city, it's 43% open space, which is an astonishing ratio of open space. And a lot of this is remnants, especially the streams around this western part of Sydney. Why do I keep saying east? The western part of Sydney. But a lot of it's also farmland, so it's also a slightly different context to some of our bushland areas in the other parts of Perth. It starts with landscape as the framework. The landscape structure drives the neighbourhood arrangement and lot layout, forming a living infrastructure. So we can see here the designers and planners and landscape architects are trialling different lot layouts and how they play with the different green spaces and the different streams and this green grid to try and achieve this 43% ratio. Okay, so we don't do any of this in Perth. When we do a new subdivision, it's assumed that there's going to be a very large sand pad. But we know that there's better ways of getting yield and getting developable area, and also ensuring landscape space is maintained in the system while it's happening. So there's a distributed network of wooded systems, there's high open space ratios, and connectivity is a priority. State environmental planning policy 2020, mandating tree canopy in the public domain, planning the streetscape to allow for landscape. All of these things that are very promising in terms of allowing nature and development to go hand in hand. And so we'll watch it and see how it emerges. This is a quick view of Perth. This is Stirling in 1992. And this is Stirling in 2011. So we've got a I don't know how many of you are aware that there's been a policy being developed by the state government called Design WA, which was actually doing great things to ensure that many of these lots in future areas where upzoning occurs, where a potential for, this is R40, R60, a potential for greater density emerges and is blanket zoned, that tree canopy is retained in those areas. And that policy has just been shelved by the Minister for Planning and Housing on the basis of housing affordability. So we've got a lot of questions here that are emerging. There's Stirling, and there it is back in time. And that's IKEA, the IKEA swan. So this was a project we ran at the School of Design about 2 or 3 years ago with architects, and believe it or not, developers, and also landscape architects, to try and ask, okay, if we had to do that kind of an infill better, if there was going to be an upzoning and we had to do it better, what would that look like? And this is Ashfield, which is, if you don't know, around near Bassendean, up on the beautiful place on the Swan River. And around the mid-2000s, a big upzoning was floated by the Department of Planning across the whole of that Ashfield zone. And for whatever reason, it was paused, but there's potentially an imminent rezoning happening around that area in future years. So we thought it was a really good suburb to pick for this kind of a study. And here's a massive tree. It's not on a verge, it's in the front yard. And if infill housing came to this lot, if a R40 zoning went across this suburb, it would no doubt be one of the first to go. Wouldn't that be a shame for all the things we know urban trees bring to our city? I don't need to mention all those. So this is that little that little pocket of Ashfield. And Ashfield Station's here, and the Swan River's down here. And the Ashfield Flats, which is a threatened ecological community, the salt marsh down there, is also really dependent upon the water flows and the permeability of this whole suburb. So the deep structure shows a slightly higher dune, but then the groundwater flow nets all flowing down to the Ashfield Flats and feeding that area with fresh water seasonally. And so a landscape strategy started to emerge here, which brought about ecological corridors and water-sensitive urban design as a basis for this structure. And at least initially, what it said was that we could just take a corridor, essentially a green space corridor, and we weren't allowed to get rid of any trees, and we had to densify around that green space corridor. So rather than densifying around the transit system and just doing, another city of Stirling where you just blanket upzone, it was saying, how could we target upzoning around landscape infrastructure or around landscape upgrades? And these was a series of instructions that were given to design teams to come up with their responses. And it's all available on a website, Place Value Ashfield. But it was then a whole series of different housing schemes that achieved density while not getting rid of any trees, and while adding to the amenity of the suburb. So it can be done. There are ways that we can retain the tree, and this is that existing tree that I showed you in the photo before, and a team who achieved, I think it was R60 or R80 on these lots, which is 80 lots per hectare, with really good environmental outcomes and urban farming and all the other beautiful things that we can have on our verges that we know about in the community. Okay, so that's a little bit on Perth. So sorry if that's taken up most of the time.
Fantastic.
There's a little bit of forests now, just at the end. So in case you thought you were coming for the forests, I've tricked you. You've actually come for a bit of a Perth spiel on Perth. Perth's urban footprint, the forests area. So we can see I just really love that. That's the length of Perth, 30 odd kilometres. That's the southwest forests. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I grew up down in the southwest in Denmark, so I had a long connection with Jess Beckerling, who's the convener of the WA Forest Alliance. And about 8 or so years ago, she came to me and she said, I heard you've been doing a lot of maps. And so we just started collecting maps. And it was a gradual thing. We wrote to different government departments and found that there was a trove of data collected over really more than a century through the southwest forest because of the logging operation that had gone on there, of course, for a long time. So this is those southwest forests here, and a beautiful photo here by Mariella Spinozupa, which is of a curry, of course. So this was a report that was published before the Forests Atlas, and it was looking at new protected areas in the southwest forest, and it was again working with the Velia Group and the Lewin Group, who published the report. So the announcement to end native forest logging came with a promise from the McGowan government for at least 400,000 hectares of new protected areas. And what started to happen as that announcement was made is draft FMPs were released, and it was not quite clear where that 400,000 hectares was on the maps. So we set about this project of compiling all the data, rare forest ecosystems, waterways, threatened ecological communities, there aren't that many of those in the forest, but those adjacent areas, threatened priority flora, forests that were obviously old growth, never logged, also forests that haven't been logged since the 1950s, 1960s. And it was a whole values-based assessment through the mapping of these different environmental values and different environmental layers to try and look at, okay, there's almost 3 million hectares of forests area through the southwest there, and where can that next raft of conservation and protected areas go? And then there were all these conversations with community, with elders like Dr. Noel Nann up there, and a lot of those 23, I think, forest groups through the southwest who are involved with WAFA. So this is our current map of formerly protected areas. We've got 1,077,000 odd hectares of formerly protected areas. So that's national parks, predominantly, but also nature reserves, and 5.1G protected areas, and also conservation parks. So all those formerly protected areas under the CARMAC. So we're 43% protection. And immediately we thought, okay, the FMP uses the old Calm districts, or the Warren district, blah blah blah. We thought, let's separate this more logically around the fragmentation due to farmland and other things. Let's try and separate this into very broad areas. So we drew out the Northern Jarrah forest there. We drew out this Sandy Basins Jarrah region around Collie, and separated by those agricultural fragmentation through there. We drew out the Witcher Blackwood, which connected the Witcher Scarp through the Blackwood River, the Donnelly River, the Greater Kingston, and then this is a little Warren River in here, and then the Southern Forest region down the bottom. And when we put the protected areas, the existing protected areas over those, which are the black dots, we saw that the Southern Forests were 88% formerly protected, very high. Greater Kingston, 52, Greater Donnelly, only 27, but up to the Northern Jarrah and Sandy Basins, only 23% in existing formal conservation. So it can be said that there's more than 1 million hectares of national parks in the Southwest Forest, but if you look at area by area, it's a very disproportionate rate of protection. So back to this map. This was the sort of iteration of this. I haven't got the step-by-step here, which is a bit annoying. But essentially, these lighter green areas, now they're areas that have been proposed in previous FMPs, but not yet gazetted. So that includes areas like Julimar, other areas through the Southwest Forest. And those lighter green areas were the areas, the next 400,000 hectares of areas that we mapped as part of this project. And what that did is bring up the representativity of these areas quite substantially. So the Northern Jarrah now sits at 65%, Sandy Basins at 54%, Witcher Blackwood, Greater Donnelly, and then all those southern regions from the Greater Kingston to the southern forests, up to 100% protection. So this report was released about pretty much exactly 1 year ago, and it's become an important reference point for certainly for WAFA, but certainly also in terms of understanding if and when this next 400,000 is proposed, hopefully in the final version of the Forest Management Plan, we'll be able to look against those environmental values and understand how they've been defined. So this all made its way into this book, The Forest Atlas, and I was working on this project when we had no idea that the logging was going to end. That announcement, I think, came to everybody in the movement as an amazing surprise. And it was obviously standing on the shoulders of so many years of really hard work by so many people for a really long time, and probably also a lot of you in this room involved in many, many years of work in that movement. And it was this sort of speechless moment where we were literally putting together this book, and what it was attempting to do, it was a much more aggressive book. It wasn't like a beautiful book. It was a more aggressive book that was saying, we can't afford to put these areas on this next round of logging plans. And it was trying to exclude areas from those COOP maps that DBCA and the Forest Products Commission were bringing out on an annual basis. But when that announcement was made, I remember speaking to Jess and a number of other people around at the time and saying, this can just be now a celebration. This can be really, we can put all these maps into a book and call it a celebration book and make it a much more beautiful book. And I'm glad it all sort of happened. So this is at the launch, and I've got this photo because these are the wonderful collaborators. So Alice Ford here is a fantastic local artist who paints almost botanically, but also gives her paintings beautiful character in a way. And Noel Nannup, who many of you will recognise, contributed a great narrative to the book. Clancy Martin, who's a photographer, an artist, and Nansen, a photographer as well, who all contributed to this book. And the details and all the exciting things in the book, I think, are really beautiful. And it comes from also this desire, in terms of the maps, there's a Mananai Quokka and a couple of numbats. This one says spot all the threatened marsupials in the Greater Kingston region. And there's 6 of them, and you've got to try and find them all. It comes out of this desire also that these maps are in the public domain. They are accessible through Data WA if you've got all the GIS wizardry and knowledge. But if you're just a regular member of the public, these maps aren't easy to find. And a lot of people have said, thank you for producing these maps, which are very simple, but it tells you where the carry is, and it tells us where the areas recently logged are, and it tells us where these are the mappings of the threatened and priority fauna through the southwest. It shows us the Greater Kingston region is just lighting up with numbats and boilies and phascogales. So it took this base layer for the forests, and similar to that other project, layered in all of these values. And Alice did this drawing of this wheel, the interconnectedness of the forests and all of the relationships between those different layers. A burrowing crayfish, I think a Walpole burrowing crayfish, also in the forests area. She was keen to expose those creatures we might not usually associate with the forests. It's the deep river in Walpole. And the wetlands and waterways through the southwest forests. And the drawing of the Nama. Old growth jarrah. And some photos of this around Lane Pool and Wellingham. A category here which is two-tiered jarrah. Which is jarrah that has been logged before the 1980s, which has this like 2-tier quality and characteristics, similar to 2-tier carrot. And then the Wandoo, the rare forest ecosystems. This map shows all the Wandoo through the eastern part of the forest area there. I'm going to buy them. They're $55. There you go. They're not very fat. Okay.